All right, so we finished up with a brief review of classical conditioning, which you should be familiar with from Psychology 101, but if not, you got the information you needed there. If you are, hopefully it was a helpful review, because now we're going to be looking at a lot of interesting phenomena through classical conditioning as applied to marketing. And we're also going to learn more about classical conditioning than you might have known before as we go, like what is primary and secondary order conditioning. So primary order conditioning is what we just looked at. It begins with a UCS and a UCR. Remember, that's an unlearned stimulus, an unlearned response, such as the McDonald's example. When people think about food, they salivate, right? But classical conditioning doesn't always begin with the UCS and UCR. There's also secondary order conditioning, which begins with a stimulus and a response that you have previously learned. So you were not born associating Michael Jordan with athleticism, but you likely learned this association previously. So now Nike can use an ad like this and just put Jordan's picture on an ad and thus associate their shoes with athleticism. And in this case now we have a second order stimulus, SOS, a second order response, SOR, a conditioned newly learned stimulus, and a conditioned newly learned response. So why don't you practice identifying those and click the video back on. All right, the SOS is Jordan, the SOR, thoughts of athleticism, the CS, shoes, and the CR, thoughts of athleticism. Now, you might have used slightly different wording, but if you had the same concepts in mind, you're fine. Remember that for a test, all you need to do is identify the right answer among multiple choice. Of course, products can become associated with anything else about the celebrity. And it is really hard to find squeaky clean celebrities, or non-celebrities for that matter. A delinquent gambling debt on the part of Jordan caused Nike some apprehension in the past, although it didn't prove to be enough for him to lose this really major endorsement. Acquisition is acquiring a new response. Extinction is losing one, right? Especially when it is repeatedly not followed by the conditioned stimulus. Pavlov's dogs learned a conditioned response to the bell. But if Pavlov stopped following the bell with food, over time, the dogs would stop responding to the bell. In other words, their conditioned response would become extinct. Generalization is when a conditioned response generalizes to similar stimuli. So think back to Pavlov's dogs again. They acquired a response to his bell, right? That was acquisition. Assume that Pavlov needs more space and rents a wing of a high school that is not being used for his lab. How do you think the dogs would respond to all those class bells? They will generalize their response. You see, generalization, they're responding to similar stimuli. In other words, they're responding to the hallway bells the same way they respond to Pavlov's bell. However, they're not fed following the hall bells. How long do you think it would take before they stop responding to the hallway bells? In other words, for that response to go extinct and only respond to Pavlov's bell? Well, the answer to that depends on many things, right? The age of the dog, the breed of the dog, the social environment, etc. But sooner or later, they're going to catch on, right? But anyway, sooner or later, and at that point, when they can tell them apart, they're only responding to the Pavlov's bell again, we have discrimination. So that's a great term for remembering this. They've learned to discriminate between them, to tell them apart. So discrimination is when they only respond to the particular stimulus, no longer are to something similar. So let's look at some classical conditioning marketing phenomena now based on some of this. Exemplar-based learning is an interesting type of classical conditioning where marketers intentionally promote generalization, right? So if a new stimulus reminds you of one you are already familiar with, you will likely respond to it in a similar way. Here's two examples of how this is used in marketing. First, family brands. Many companies capitalize on exemplar-based learning and generalization by adding other product lines under a previously established brand name. So an example of that, Dole, which was associated with fruit, now also sells juice and juice bars, right? Many different juices and juice bars. And as the picture here shows, Campbell's is no longer just soups. The second example is copycat brands. These are interesting. They're an interesting use of classical conditioning. If a new stimulus reminds you of one you are already familiar with, this can trigger generalization, and you are likely to respond to it in a similar way. Notice that a consumer must look really closely to distinguish the difference between the name brand product in this picture and the generic brand. In traditional classical conditioning, the response is a behavioral response, right? So now there is also evaluative conditioning. Evaluative conditioning is a special case of classical conditioning in which the response is cognitive, an attitude most often paired with a belief. So when we say cognitive, we mean an attitude. And now the response is cognitive, an attitude most often paired with a belief. For instance, pairing Domino's pizza with a race car in TV ads encourages customers to infer that Domino's pizza is exciting, that's an attitude, and has fast delivery, that is a belief, right? Pairing Charmin bathroom tissue with a gentle, fluffy bear encourages consumers to infer that Charmin is nice, the attitude, and soft, the belief. Both traditional classical conditioning and evaluative conditioning work best when the pairing occurs every time, consistently. However, evaluative conditioning is more valuable to marketers than traditional classical conditioning because it is stronger. More specifically, it is less vulnerable to going extinct because of non-pairing. It's still vulnerable and still best when consistently paired, but less vulnerable than classical conditioning. Here's an example. After seeing Charmin paired with the soft bear enough, you acquire the nice and soft association. You may then see the brand Charmin often without the bear, but your nice and soft association isn't necessarily extinguished. In other words, isn't wiped out. No pun intended. So an advantage of using evaluative conditioning in marketing is that it is less vulnerable to extinction than traditional classical conditioning.